Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion about transforming global value chains, good jobs, sustainability, and gains from trade. You're very welcome here in the room in Berlin and watching us remotely as well. I'm Declan Curry. I'm a journalist and broadcaster. Please join me in welcoming our speakers, Petra Gistenhoven, Muriel Pénicaud, and Dominic Wahre, and joining us remotely, Helena Laurent and Danny Roderick. Give them all a round of applause, please. Petra Gistenhoven is chairwoman of the management board at PwC Germany and PwC Europe. PwC, of course, a global consultancy and business advisory firm. Helena Laurent is Director General of Consumers International. That's the only global membership organization for consumer groups, empowering and championing the rights of consumers in more than 100 nations. Muriel Pénicaud is a former French Labour Minister, a former permanent representative of France to the OECD, and has also been a senior executive at the global food giant Danone and at the software company Dassault. Danny Roderick is a Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy, Harvard and University, widely published in the areas of international economics, economic development and political economy. And Dominic Wahre is Executive Vice President for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. That's a chief executive-led community of over 200 of the world's leading sustainable businesses working collectively to accelerate transformation. So transforming manufacturing and services from national industries to global endeavours has slashed the price of everyday items from cars to computers to clothes. It has created wealth and developed skills in the global south, but it has also led to unemployment, decay and disenchantment in former industrial areas of older economies and has a high cost in terms of working conditions and environmental impact. So how do we create and transform global value chains that create good, safe, rewarding jobs, that promote economic gain and well-being throughout the planet and leaves a lighter footprint on the world? Let's start, Muriel, with you, with your perspective as a former minister, as a former international thinker at the OECD and someone who knows business very well. How do we create or transform those global value chains?
I think that to understand how to transform the global value chains, we need first to acknowledge that it's going to change anyhow for several reasons. The first one is clearly the green transition. It changes a lot of things. If you want to have less CO2, the production between which is local and which is global will change. But it's also the artificial intelligence. It will be a big change in all jobs, because it means that tomorrow a lot of what we called the white-collar workers could be anywhere. And that job is going to change, but the way and where they work will change too. And also because of the COVID and the political tension today, the need for many countries to have more sovereignty on their industry, on their drugs, on many domains, is a trend that goes in this direction. So anyhow, it will move with a mix of local and global. It will move with a big change in the content of jobs. But the question is how we make this an opportunity to make it more fairer, to be more social and green-oriented. It's not a given. Is that the jobs we all have collectively to do anyhow? Because it will change. The right direction is not yet sure.
And this is the change that is coming. This is what lies ahead of us.
The change comes anyhow. But do we make this change a chance for developing countries, for young people, for women, for unemployed people everywhere? That's the point.
And Danny Roderick of Harvard University, this is change that comes on top of an existing period of rapid change that the world has seen. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the change was inevitable, and I think we're seeing a kind of a backlash against a system that had created lots of economic and social and political tensions, and didn't had a blind spot with respect to the increasing geopolitical tensions with China. So the question is, we can't really return to what we had, and as Mariel mentioned, this is a change that we will have to handle. I think it's important to understand, one is that the key locus of authority and decision making in some sense is moving away from the global institutions and the business corporations on which we used to rely, increasingly more to national governments, and especially national governments. And so that's a major sort of shift towards a reassertion of national authority, national sovereignty. There's an immediate implication of that, which means that since governments will be going about it mostly in their own way, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity. There's on climate, on sustainability, on industrial policies, on good jobs, there's going to be a huge amount of diversity in terms of how different countries, US, middle-income countries, Europe, China, of course, are going about it. So the question is whether this all adds up to a system, or does it add up to a chaos?
Danny Roderick, just to cut in, excuse me for interrupting, are you seeing this as a retreat from globalization or globalization 2.0?
I'm seeing it as a remaking of globalization. So I don't think we should talk about more or less globalization. I think we have gone through very different systems of globalization. I do not think that we're returning back to the 1930s. So I don't think autarky is in the cards. I don't think there is going to be a really severe decoupling in the world economy. So we are seeing a process of remaking it. And I think we can really imagine a healthier globalization, as well as one that's sort of an uglier version, which perhaps would be much more driven by geopolitical competition and a new kind of a Cold War with China. That I think would be an ugly scenario, but one where in which governments are legitimately embarking on fixing their own economies and societies and fixing sustainability problems could conceivably return us to a healthier form of globalization.
Thank you. Helena Laurent, Director General of Consumers International. Let's bring you into the discussion, because I know you think that multiple historic shifts are needed in the marketplace, and shifts that benefit consumers. Tell me more.
Yeah, it's well, thank you for the opportunity to join and to be joining virtually because of injury. I hope everyone's well, and it's great to see everyone there. The interesting thing is consumers are supposed to benefit from value chains and from our current trade regime. Right now, whichever consumer organization we talk to around the world, they have three very common concerns. The first is, of course, the cost of living. Even though you see commodity prices coming down, the cost of living is top of mind around the world. That comes up on top of concerns about what the digital future brings us. Yes, aware of potential opportunities, absolutely, but the scams, the risks that come online are those that consumers everywhere find really difficult to deal with. And then this growing concern, real concern about what is happening with our climate, but lack of clarity about what to do about it. And so I'm hoping that the new forms of globalization or new forms of system help on those fronts, right? And that can come, in our view, from bringing the consumer need, the consumer protection back into some of our trade thinking. It's actually quite rare that you have trade agreements or trade policies that explicitly talk about consumer protection and what it means for people on the ground, and then better forms of actually checking what's happening at that national level and how it's working for people, so we have a more agile approach, agile responses to shifting to what works.
And thank you, Mira. That's precisely the point, listening to what you've said, to what Helena said, to what Danny has said, there are three quite different agendas on what is needed to bring about this systemic change in global trade policy. Now, you're someone who knows about the thinking that's done at a global level on trade. How do you possibly come up with trade agreements that satisfy all those different aspects on those agendas?
So first we have to accept that there is a part of contradiction. It's clear that the first phase of globalization, as Elena said, has led to, for the West, to a very good purchasing power because products were produced somewhere where people were less paid and sometimes not with a decent job, so with a social burden, but at the same time it was good for the consumer. Somewhere else.
But it did
so
also
this
create,
kind of contradiction does exist.
But it did also create wealth and opportunity and jobs in those areas where they did not exist before.
Not always a good job, but jobs. And it destroyed jobs in the West, but more purchasing power, if I make it very simple, and the opposite in some area. But today, there are a lot of different challenges. In China, the middle class has raised now to supply their own population has become something very important for China. For Africa, it's very important that they have a lot of raw materials they can produce to get jobs, not only having only immigration as a whole. And in Europe, the purchasing power is challenged, but also the jobs of tomorrow, because as I said, a lot of jobs can come back, but probably more can go away, especially white-collar workers. So when you put all that, the question is not that there are contradictions, is how we put the multilateral system around the table to find the best way. And that's where we have a problem, is that our international bodies are very segmented. So, for instance, the WTO, where we negotiate treaties, trade treaties, until now, has never taken into account seriously the ecological and social matters. If we don't...
They've not been in the agreement.
No. And it's the same countries around the table, but not with the same lens.
Because it was too difficult or because it wasn't thought to be important?
Because it will bring to other problems. Because if you take into account the social conditions, then the country that will be happy will not be the same that if you don't make a condition. The same for the environment. So, as I love to quote McCartney, former governor of Bank of England, a French person, you see, and because he was saying there's a tragedy of horizons. Horizons of time are different for countries, for continents, but also between the economic, social, and ecological goals. But probably our opportunity now. The scale and speed of change is so huge in front of us. If everybody is going to lose if we don't ally. That's my hope, that we go on a stronger multilateral agenda, like Chancellor Scholz called for it, and is very committed. He told us that. That's the key point to go ahead together.
Okay, thank you. Petra, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, advises companies around the world on sustainability and value chains. In those conversations with the leaders of business, do you get a sense that they recognize that change is needed, that they see it is urgent? And if that's the case, what do they think they need to do?
Yeah, so looking at some facts, we interviewed at the beginning of the year more than 4,500 CEOs around the world, and they do need and recognize the need and the urgency for a sustainable transformation. So just to give you two numbers, in Germany, every fourth of the CEO says, and worldwide, more than 40% that their business model is not going to be viable in 10 years' time if they just don't change the course. So it's a clear matter of fact, there is recognition of the fact we need to sustainable transform. Now, what they do is looking into also their value chain in terms of transformation in the different aspects. And there is the prosperity, we know about the financial KPIs, it's the economic piece, but it's also the ecologic and the social piece. And I think there is, and I go back to what Mirel just said, this big question of alignment, alignment of the policies the companies need to follow, rightly so, of the short-termism versus the long-termism, and also what you just said, the common global narrative, the common global standards. And there are some gaps in all those three, which we need to fill going forward, but I think the willingness is there, the urgency is there. Now it's about the how to move forward very fast.
Okay, thank you. Well, one example of the how, Dominic, you might be able to provide, because your council has been working on how you scale up sustainability across value chains in a number of different sectors. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Declan. I think that's the kind of the word of the conversation, if I may, which is, okay, so we understand we have a systemic, multi-issue problem. We heard about a multipolar world. Given that, we still need to create lots of jobs which are good and fulfilling and fair in terms of pay and rights. And we need to live within our planetary boundaries. And we have probably about 9 billion people on the planet, over the next few decades. So how do we do that? The value chain concept, of course, is something that connects lots of countries as things are made. You have to kind of find the raw materials, have to turn it into things, have to manufacture it, have to sell it. And of course, that's a very linear concept because the other end of it is lots of waste. And indeed, the kind of notion of an extractive industry sort of exemplifies that challenge. I think it's a thread, Declan, that brings together a lot of the different things that we are saying.
So just to be clear on that, so in the past, companies knew there was a demand for a product, they made the product, they sold the product to the customers, and then at the end of it, well, that wasn't their problem. Now you're saying it should be.
Well, you could say the same about GDP as a macroeconomic indicator, same throughput with no kind of circularity attached to it. Imagine if you're Zambia and it was always your copper, right? And go figure. Because then with the technology that we have today, that can go all the way through the system and come back, and you can invest in high quality jobs and cycling of the copper in Zambia. Plastics is a kind of topic du jour at the moment. 1.8 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions comes from plastics, about 3.4% of global emissions. That's more than aviation. Primarily from production from fossil-based feedstock. Studies would tell us, as a Nordic Council of Ministers actually, we're another great group of leaders in this space, that if we didn't incinerate at the end of the use of plastics, that would save us 55% of greenhouse gases per ton. If we didn't use the feedstock of oil and gas, but we had a circular plastic value chain, that would save us 34% of emissions at the front end. So there are various examples, whether they are kind of rare earth metals, core metals that we need, or indeed materials like plastics, that if we refigured how we work our value chains, we could probably get our way through this. It's not easy, because it does absolutely, as you say, require the trade organizations, the environmental organizations, the labor organizations to look at this systemically. We'd have to kind of reimagine what a Basel Convention looks like, which at the moment stops you transferring secondary materials, good quality secondary materials, across boundaries. We almost have to circularize some of these conventions. It can be done, and the how-to is the knowledge that we are garnishing about getting it done.
You said can be done. Is it being done? Is it too early at this point to talk about if this is being implemented?
Systems change is that kind of figure. If you get about 20% max of the market to go in a certain direction, you get a flip. So the question is, you don't have to have everybody do it. You need a kind of a leading club to lean in and shift the rest. And that really is the sort of MO of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, 227 of the leading companies in the world, including PwC and many others. And that is starting to happen. EV, electric vehicles, is probably quite a good example of that. I imagine if you thought 15 years ago, Declan, that would I ever get an EV car? And now you're probably thinking, I should get an EV car.
It'll be if not the car you've got already, then it's the next car that you might get.
And then hold that thought about EV car, because then think about the value chain that goes into it. All of those rare earth metals, all that glass, all that copper, what happens at the end of it? Circularize the value chain with the EV, you start to get to solve this problem.
Is this what you're hearing as well?
Exactly, and I think it's even plus the infrastructure, plus the customer behavior. So it's all an ecosystem which is interrelated and connected.
Thank you. Just to say to those in the room, as well as hearing from our speakers here and remotely, I'm going to ask to hear from some of you as well. So please have some thoughts, some observations that you might want to share. And when I ask for them in about 15 minutes or so from now, put your hand up quickly and we'll get a microphone to you and you can share your thoughts and your questions with the speakers. Those of you watching remotely, I'm terribly sorry. But if you want to ask a question, then you've got to be here. Now, let's look at some practical sort of aspects of this then. Let me pick one topic. How you've talked about the impact in the global south, in the manufacturing nations of globalization so far. And you've recognized rightly that there is widespread concern about the quality of those jobs, about what they pay, about working conditions. How do we improve that as we change global value chains?
First, I think that you need pioneers. You need politics and you need pioneers. Politics are made to make the whole boat go ahead. But usually it starts by some pioneers. Can be companies working with NGOs, with unions. You need this kind of leaders. And I fully agree with what you said, Jetta. I'm also a senior advisor and a board member of several global companies. They are all on the sustainable agenda, and not only for compliance reasons. More and more, even in the financial market, is moving in the direction to think it's not only a question of compliance, it's a question of sustainable and investment, and profitable investment over time. So this shift is not totally done, but has started. So we need this kind of pioneers. Something very important that they take in consideration the social part. Today there is a lot of attention on the greening economy, not yet enough on the social part. All the move we have said about AI, value chain changing with more local and global and greening economy, it's more than 1 billion jobs that are going to change since from now to 2030. It's tomorrow morning.
Because of automation?
Because not only automation, greening, I mean, agriculture is changing, energy, raw material, management of water, of resources, the whole industry is changing, the whole construction. So it's different jobs, and sometimes not always at the same place. In India or in Poland, 80% of the energy comes from the coal. If you close the coal, how you convert all people in renewable energy or nuclear from one day to another, it's not easy. And usually it's not the same region. So it's a question of territories also. So if we don't anticipate all the social burdens, the social risk and opportunities to get new jobs and sometimes very often better jobs, then we'll have a huge social problem. And then for governments, they will go back for the short term.
Sure.
And
but
if they are going back and forth, then the company will be lost because they cannot build something that will change every morning.
But in terms of how this is to be done, what is the mechanism? So, is it to write it in to global trade deals? Is it companies such as those that PwC advises putting it in their terms for their engagement of suppliers? What's the mechanism?
You need three things at the same time. You need leading global companies, because the value chain is dependent of them, doing the work on sustainability, on the greening economy, working with NGO and working with unions on the social part first. Second, you need government at the G7, at the G20 to push our multilateral organization, WTO, to work with the ILO, with greening, it's everywhere, nowhere, to work with the other organization to have a common agenda, to put that in the treaty. And third, you need, from a global perspective, to encourage the finance system to invest in this mid-long term agenda, because otherwise, I mean, they are prescripting the economy, otherwise it will not last.
Helena Laurent from Consumer International, when we talk about how we get better jobs in the manufacturing nations in the global south, how we care for people whose jobs may be changed, replaced, lost by automation. What is the role of regulation? What is the role of local regulation?
I think there are two things here, right? Many companies will say, but how am I supposed to chase a future unless I'm pushed by regulation? Where is the consumer? Where's the market for this? And what am I leaning into? What am I building towards? So we would look at two things. I think you've got to keep the trust with people who've got to come through this journey as workers, as consumers, in all aspects of their lives. That trust is essential. And the second part is, if you read the IPCC, there's a lot that has to be done through people's adoption, consumer adoption of new technologies, all right? So we've talked a lot here about the value chains and the push from the back end. We've not talked about the shift to sustainable consumption and what that means. And let's face it, what sustainable means if you're a consumer is really complex. We haven't clarified that for people. So I think there are two bits. One is at local and at international level saying, all right, what is our view of how to maintain trust? Remember that consumer rights are not just about access and economic choice. It's product safety. Safety actually means sustainability these days. It's about information. It's about redress. Can I trust that this system will look after me as we go through it? And on the technology side, or the shifts that we need to see in consumer behavior, you've got a similar set of principles that you can have in place. Now, locally, that's the only way in which you can see if this is working. And we haven't really got the systems in place right now to give the feedback loops on, is this moving us in the right direction? We've got a couple of examples of that, say in digital finance, where you can get consumer organizations talking to regulators about what's happening and what the impact is of their policies. That sort of agility and network needs to be in place if we're going to get movement happening as fast as we need it to.
Thank you. You were nodding in agreement there. I'm struck that we are still looking at sort of parallel approaches to this. We've got the intergovernmental regulatory approach. We've got businesses and leaders in the boardroom. We've got the impulse from consumers. When do they align? When do they stop being parallel tracks?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of movements towards that directions. Are we there? No. Yeah. Is it a long way to go? Yes. But we see, and I think that's a positive, incentivization for that behavior is key. And what happens, there are a lot of movements, for example, the Value Balancing Alliance, which goes for let's measure impact of businesses. And I think that leads to transparency and data, and this leads to trust, what we've just heard. Yeah? So creating that transparency and data is very, very important. So you see policymakers going ahead. So we have one of those laws right now in Germany, but other nations have done likewise. It's a law, you could call it the Act of Corporate Due Diligence Obligations in the Supply Chain, and it looks after transparency on human rights. It looks after, for example, the aspects of environmental destruction of hazardous waste. Yeah? So what does it do? The large companies, they are going first, and they can be the multipliers. They need to look into their value chain, not only to the first-tier supplier, but to the end-tier suppliers going ahead. And now that you need to do that, you see more. And then you see all those aspects, and decision-making is about to change, considering just the aspects we have mentioned. And I think that's the way we have to do. So your question, is it aligned? Not perfectly yet, but it's a way going forward. And I think the challenge we have is, measure what matters and focus on the real important thing. So that it doesn't go to the other side, that this regulation, which has a really good intention, incentivization, doesn't mean it's a burden of administration. Yeah? So we need to keep it together, doable, focus on what matters most, transparent, and so that we can have transparent and comparative data out from it. And then we see sort of businesses reacting in the right way.
Yes, go on.
Yeah, just to continue on that, two concrete things. First, measure is needed for progress, fully agree. There's a measure we know and we don't act enough. Each time a company or a country empowers economically women, the GDP grows. The Global Summit of Women has shown that. A lot of studies show that investing on women empowerment makes more stability, more growth, more resilience, more innovation.
So why isn't it happening?
Why are we not doing faster?
Well, why are we not doing it?
A lot of reasons. We can do the whole day on that. But I just mentioned that to say that we have a tool on that. Second tool, I give you an example because you wanted a concrete example. 10 years from now, I was a senior executive at Group Danone. We decided to launch, to create a healthcare in all our value chain for all the workers, the 100,000 workers in the world. It was the first company to do it. Now a lot of do it. So initially you can say it's a cost, so it will be bad for the consumer at the end because it will raise the cost. Not at all. Investing socially on people has been more safety, more engagement, less absenteeism, less dropout, and at the end it was made for social reason. It was financially better with more decent jobs, better jobs for people, but also at the end, there is no resource for the consumer. So sometimes also we are afraid, thinking that increasing labor cost is always something bad for the business. Not always. Good social investment can be good, and investing on women also.
Okay, quick thought.
I couldn't agree more. And Danone is a really good example of one of those in practice. In fact, a B Corp at the kind of in the French jurisdiction. Here's a practical example, Declan, for everybody listening and watching. The Business Commission for Tackling Inequality, 60 commissioners, including multinational CEOs, including some around the table, and others from civil society, have set out like a 10-point plan. Here are the things that we can do now to shift this equation. It absolutely fits into your value chain of change, which is the first thing we need is a positive impulse from across public and private and civil society to make change happen, to give confidence to the policymakers to absorb and change in that way. Business Commission to Tackle Inequality.
Let me make sure I've understood that correctly. So what you're saying is businesses in some of these areas for the E as well as the S, for environmental as well as social. Business is leading, civil society is leading, and they're creating the dynamic that allows the politicians to follow behind later.
Absolutely. So here's the thing. Do you remember, who here remembers the Copenhagen Climate Summit 2009? Yeah, 2009.
Some of them may have been at it.
Was anybody there? Anybody at it? All right. So remember that period after when it dawned on the international community that international governance alone won't solve the problem. And now we don't think twice about innovation, business, technology, finance, partnerships, helping to solve the climate challenge. That is where we're at on the tackling inequality challenge. We're just opening up that door with this leader group. If we came back, if we're all still interested 10 years from now, I guarantee we would have a different, much more mainstreamed agenda with the WTO, the environmental international organizations, ILO, UNDP, in a very much more integrated way, as we've seen in climate.
Danny Roderick, this is a good point to bring you back into the conversation, because the conclusion we're heading towards is that we're not just relying on the big organizations like the G20 or the WTO anymore. A lot of the change is going to come in the boardroom. A lot of the change is going to come from civil society.
Absolutely. And I think there is, in fact, a lot of alignment that is going on with respect to social and environmental values that have now been internalized in corporate boardrooms, and I think behavior is changing. I think business in some ways has been acting faster because it can move more quickly, but it's also reacting to a general environment, general change in values in society. And I think that just to give you an example of sort of some of the things that we've talked about, how business could help with good jobs in low and middle income countries by investing in suppliers in the local economy, cultivating local input suppliers and transferring technology. by helping uphold labor rights and setting up a good example for sort of relations with labor relations and labor rights in those settings, and also being responsible in the use of technology in the way that they adopt and adapt technology is not simply, for example, to monitor workers and getting productivity that way, but actually using digital and AI tools to augment the skills that less educated workers have to actually empower them to provide customized services rather than using technology simply to replace or displace workers or to turn them into sort of monitored employees with very little agency and autonomy. So there's all these ways in which I think business can contribute, and I think that's the good news. I think sort of what we also, however, need to take into account is that for the most part, if we're answering, for example, the question, where will the good jobs come from in the world economy? It's going to come mostly from areas of the economy that are not going to be they're going to be non-tradable. They're going to be services that are not necessarily being traded. And global value chains are already peaked and they've been coming down. And so, it's great that businesses engage in this. There's greater responsibility. But more and more, I think the statistical mathematical certainty is that 80-90% of the good jobs will have to be generated by smaller and medium-sized enterprises in domestic services, in retail, care, education. And there where I think there is lesser leverage that sort of this international corporate sense of responsibility is going to have an impact. So I think if we're going to be successful, it's going to be very important that local authorities and governments do their job in a way that actually pursues these objectives.
Okay, Danny Roderick, thank you. Dominic, quick thought?
Yeah, just on that one, this idea of the just transition is key. There's kind of more jobs per megawatt in that green transition, particularly in solar and servicing and wind and servicing, there has been in our kind of 20th century fossil-based economy. So I think there will be, the possibility for quite some decent jobs in that just transition. I think a word just to put on the table is accountability. Because if we don't have the kind of accountability frameworks, then there's always a fear there's a Wild West. And people are greenwashing and this, that, and the other. And that's where, in fact, the former CEO of Danone, Emmanuel Faber, is leading something called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is coming up with exactly these kinds of guidelines. And this is something that our colleagues at PwC and others are paying a lot of attention to, because this will be the framework within which this shift can happen. And once that gets adopted and mandated in certain jurisdictions, this will accelerate this change. Okay, thank you. Let's see if we have some thoughts from the floor, from people who are listening to us here in the room in Berlin. We have a hand towards the... If you just keep your hand up, please, Salma, until we get the microphone to you.
Everyone here.
And there's... Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Salma Abbasi. I think this is an excellent panel, and it comes right back to what I was talking about earlier, about the agriculture value chain, looking at ecosystems. So when you look at supply chain, like the colleague on the video just said, it's actually going to create new jobs for energy providers, clean energy providers, but also the multimodal logistics systems that use bicycles. So we can think of unconventional ways where you have a robust multimodal agricultural system. You've got refrigeration units that are also amazingly small, but it's an entrepreneur. And then when you talk about women in agriculture, they are mainly women who are in the rural areas. So if you look at this holistically, with the right enabling policies, you do a social uplifting from the grassroots right to the city, and Africa is the place where you can see this right now happening, particularly East Africa. Thanks, Declan.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some hands over here as well, so we'll just get the microphone to this side of the room. Just keep your hand up until we... I know it's a strain, but we will get the microphone to you in due course. Here it is. And when it reaches you, just tell us who you are and what organisation you represent, if any. Gentleman at the back first, please, and then the one in front.
Thank you. So I'm Yves Tiberghien from UBC in Canada, British Columbia. Question for Danny. Deregulation and globalization was coordinated, was a result of all kind of agreements. The current deglobalization or peaking of globalization of value chains is the result of individual actions by states and other actors that are not coordinated. Can this generate a tit-for-tat a momentum that could lead to bring down parts of the system. There's no guardrails, apparently.
Okay, then I'll come in. Danny, did you get that?
Yes, I'm much more sort of optimistic on this, or I do think that when I mean if you know that economics we teach that international trade is good for a country for its own sake, not to produce benefits for its trade partners. Similarly, openness to capital flows, macroeconomic stability, all these good things that countries are supposed to do to maintain an open, healthy world economy are largely things that are good for countries in themselves. So if countries are able to solve their own distributional and social problems and address the kind of social divisions that have been exacerbated by the last 30 years of hyperglobalization, actually, sort of acting on their own and independently, they should pursue policies that are going to be more supportive of a healthy world economy. So I
okay, thank you, Danny. Sorry to cut in. We have to leave it there. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Christoph Roland from Climate Solution. My question is, thinking of the consumer and thinking of the chain of the production, do you think that an international labeling would help to reduce CO2 emissions?
Thank you. Helena, that sounds like a question for you. International standards for labelling, giving consumers around the world more information, consistent information. Does that make a difference?
Absolutely, yes. There are a good swathe of consumers who look at labels and care about this. Information to consumers is one of the core things that we can do. We don't have sufficient harmonized information, which allows smaller enterprises to just meet that bar. It's extremely confusing. It would be fantastic to have a common standard. It can be quite complex, of course, but we can work through that complexity. And it's not enough just to have information. That's the only thing. We can't just leave it at information for people to really change their lives and lean into a very different economy and build a very different economy. So not just and.
Okay, thank you very much. Some final thoughts from our three panelists here in the room in Berlin. Where next?
Well, I mean, we have to do this. We have to kind of find a way that we can have 9 billion people living well within planetary boundaries. We just have to do that. We can see that the system change can happen by a leading club of actors, whether these are leading businesses, leading civil society organizations, working with leaders from national governments or some in the international community. The Business Commission Tackling Inequality does that. We've seen that innovation after the Copenhagen climate summit towards Paris and beyond. We can see it taking shape in the nature agenda. The question is whether we have the courage of leadership to get behind some of those leading moments, and we have the quality of leadership on both business, investor, and intergovernmental communities to turn that into the accountability structures that will put all of these values into the right space so that we do the right thing, not the wrong thing.
Thank you, Petro. What's next?
Even better alignment, more trust, and a better understanding of businesses, policymakers, and civil society will make the change that matters.
Thank you. Can this be done?
We need to accelerate. And to accelerate and build this just transition, we absolutely need the connection between leadership in business, leadership in policy making, national and international, civil society, NGOs, and unions, because if we don't succeed to connect the social, the ecological economy, we will fail. If we are able to connect and put a lot of innovation around that, social innovation and technological innovation, yes, in this case, we can build something new with more valuable than today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments and your input from the floor. Please join me in giving a round of applause to say thank you to all of our speakers.